A homeless man, his hair and beard white as snow, stands silently before the bar in a Brooklyn courtroom. His crime? Stealing a loaf of bread. The prosecutor declares it coldly. The audience chuckles softly, but Judge Thomas Whitaker suddenly rises, his face pale as ash. "What is your name?" he asks, his voice trembling. The man replies softly, "Edward Harlan, sir." Tears glisten in the judge's eyes. Why does a petty theft freeze an entire courtroom? Who is this man, and what secret from the past has shaken the heart of a hardened judge? This is the story of a forgotten hero, a journey from darkness to light, where kindness and justice find their way back. Hit that subscribe button to catch more inspiring and gripping stories on our channel. In the frigid streets of Brooklyn, Edward Harlan, 66 years old, is a familiar yet nearly invisible figure. Gaunt, weathered. He walks slowly, his shoulders hunched under the weight of an old army backpack. Its faded green canvas, its frayed straps, mirror his life, once resilient, now mere remnants. A tangled silver beard obscures a once sturdy face, hiding deep eyes that hold stories no one bothers to ask about. To the locals, Edward is part of the urban landscape, like cracked sidewalks, like flickering streetlights. He doesn't beg, doesn't cause trouble, existing quietly, a ghost amidst the bustling tide of life. Edward survives by collecting recyclable bottles and cans. The few coins he earns keep him afloat, day by day. Sometimes, a kind-hearted chef at a corner diner discreetly leaves a portion of leftovers. Edward accepts with a silent nod, offering no thanks, as if his own voice might shatter the invisible wall he's built. At night, he seeks a street corner, a shop's doorway, or a park bench to rest, always moving carefully, avoiding disturbance. This discretion isn't born of fear, but of a rare quality, the dignity of a man who once lived for honor. Yet behind his tattered appearance lies a secret few could imagine. Edward Harlan is no nameless wanderer. He is a veteran, having served 20 years in the U.S. Army, honorably discharged in 2004, with medals marking his courage. He walked through brutal battlefields, faced death, and returned bearing scars, not just on his body, but in his soul. The people of Brooklyn, passing him daily, could never guess that the man quietly picking cans by the roadside was once a hero, one who risked his life to protect his comrades. Edward's life was once a different story, warm, full of meaning. He had Clara, the wife he loved above all, who brought light to his darkest days. They lived simply in a small Brooklyn apartment, where Clara's laughter echoed through thin walls. But in 2008, that light vanished. Clara discovered she had cancer. The Veterans Hospital, where Edward placed his trust, misdiagnosed her, worsening her condition. She passed away in agony, leaving Edward drowning in silent despair. He blamed himself, feeling he had failed to protect the woman he loved most. Post-traumatic stress disorder, already gnawing at him from his war years, became an uncontrollable beast. Clara's loss shattered everything. Edward refused family help, unwilling to be a burden. He sold their apartment, a repository of memories with Clara, and donated every penny to a charity she cherished, a final act to honor her wishes. Then he vanished, blending into the anonymous crowds of New York's streets. To Edward, being nameless was easier than living with the pain of a husband who couldn't save his wife. He chose a life on society's edges. No home, no identity, only his old backpack and memories of Clara. On freezing winter nights, when biting winds cut through him, Edward would huddle in a street corner, clutching a small plastic-wrapped photo, Clara in her wedding dress, her smile forever unfading. It was his only treasure, anchoring him to the faint light left in his soul. Once, at a soup kitchen, as bone-chilling cold turned his breath to mist, Edward opened up to a young volunteer. His voice, hoarse, seemed to fight its way out after years of silence. "It's easier to be nobody than to live with the pain of failing the one you loved," he said, his gaze distant, as if peering into a life long gone. The volunteer fell silent, sensing the weight of his sorrow, unaware that this was but a fragment of a hero once celebrated by a nation. Edward lived like a phantom, moving through Brooklyn's streets with proud silence. He never raised a hand to beg, never sought help. The army had forged in him self-reliance. Even as life pushed him to the bottom, he clung to that dignity. Locals, though familiar with his presence, rarely stopped to ask his name or story. To them, Edward was just a homeless man, a piece of the urban scenery they'd learned to ignore. But in his heart, memories of Clara and his years of service burned fiercely, buried beneath the dust of time and society's indifference. Each day, Edward walked with his heavy backpack. It held not just meager belongings, but a past both glorious and painful. He collected cans, trading them for coins to buy cough medicine when winter gripped his lungs. He slept under streetlights, in the city's hidden corners, always carrying Clara's photo, a reminder he still had a reason to go on, if only to survive another day. Edward Harlan, once a decorated hero, is now a nameless figure. But his story isn't over. A fateful moment is coming, one that will pull him from darkness back to light, where justice and kindness will find their way home. Winter's November cloaked Brooklyn in a thick, icy blanket of snow, a cold so biting it seemed to swallow every trace of warmth. Winds howled through the streets. They tore at Edward Harlan, 66 years old, sending uncontrollable shivers through his frail body. For 3 days, nothing had passed his lips. His stomach twisted in agony. His weakened frame made each step a battle. A tattered, threadbare coat offered little shield against the bone-chilling frost. With an old army backpack weighing heavily on his shoulders, Edward shuffled into Rossi's Corner, a small grocery store tucked on a street corner, its faint golden light spilling onto the snow-dusted sidewalk. Inside, the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with warm air. It left Edward dizzy with hunger. He stood silently near the bread counter. His gaunt hands trembled beneath torn gloves. The store's owner, Mr. Rossi, was busy with a customer, oblivious to the quiet figure of the homeless man. In a moment of desperation, Edward reached for an old loaf of bread, pushed to the corner of the display, and slipped it hastily into his coat. The act was swift but clumsy, as if he himself couldn't believe what he was doing. But a newly installed security mirror on the ceiling caught it all. Rossi's sharp eyes spotted the reflection. He spun around, his voice thick with anger, his hand reaching for the phone. Edward froze. He didn't run, didn't explain. The loaf peeked out from his half-zipped coat, a silent confession. His eyes were empty, only exhaustion etched across his weathered face. In his hunger, he had wagered his dignity, all for the strength to survive one more day. Within minutes, the red and blue lights of a police car flashed outside the store. 2 officers stepped in. Their breath turned to mist in the frigid air. The younger one, Jenkins, looked at Edward with a mix of curiosity and unease. As he cuffed Edward's bony wrists, Jenkins noticed a military dog tag chain glinting beneath the coat. A fleeting hesitation crossed his face, as if he sensed something profound beyond the man's ragged appearance. Edward merely nodded, his gaze distant, as if seeing another version of himself, a soldier who once stood tall, who once mattered. But now, He was just a shadow in society's eyes, led away amid the indifferent stares of onlookers. At the police station, Edward was processed like any petty thief. No one asked about his past, no one cared for the story behind his desperate act. A public defender met him for a fleeting few minutes. Her eyes betrayed haste, as if Edward were just a file to close before moving to the next case. Perfunctory questions, scribbled notes, not a shred of effort to understand the man before her. Edward sat in the station's cold room, still in his wrinkled, stale clothes from days on the streets. He didn't resist, didn't plead. His silence was a wall, shielding the pain and the pride still quietly burning in his heart. The next morning, Edward was escorted to the Brooklyn courthouse, where dim light from high windows fell on a cold stone floor. He entered. His worn shoes tapped softly on the ground, faint echoes in the vast space. No family, no friends, no one stood in the gallery to bail him out or offer comfort. Only busy court staff, a few lawyers flipping through files, and a handful of reporters, there for bigger cases. Edward stood before the bar, small and alone, as if the world had forgotten he existed. Case number 47,293, the state versus Edward Harlan. A case that seemed destined to pass quickly, just a brief line in the court's records, a fleeting moment in the justice system. No one, not even Edward, could have guessed that here, his fate would take a drastic turn. In that courtroom, the air was heavy with indifference. Those present were used to seeing homeless men, petty thefts, swift rulings. Edward, with his tangled silver beard and frayed coat, was just another familiar image in the system's endless days. But beneath that exterior was a soldier, a hero, a story waiting to be unveiled. The moment he stepped into the courtroom, carrying his old backpack and memories of a once glorious life, marked the start of a journey from darkness back to light. A secret from the past, buried for 2 decades, was about to change everything. That morning, in the Brooklyn courtroom, the air hung heavy with the familiarity of dry legal proceedings. Light from high windows spilled onto the cold stone floor. Where Edward Harlan, 66 years old, stood silently before the bar. His wrinkled clothes, his old army backpack at his feet, made him seem small in the vast expanse of the court. The crowd of onlookers, a few lawyers, and court staff glanced past him with indifferent eyes, as if he were merely a fleeting shadow in the system's endless days. Case number 47,293, the state versus Edward Harlan. A stolen loaf of bread, a minor charge, one that seemed destined to end swiftly, like so many others. A young prosecutor, adjusting his tie with confident ease, stepped to the podium. His voice was clear, cold, as if reciting a script memorized by heart. He accused Edward of being caught red-handed stealing a loaf from Rossi's corner grocery, emphasizing that with a history of petty theft and no fixed address, Edward was a risk who should remain detained. His words rang out, stark, emotionless, as if the man's fate before him were just a number in a file. The courtroom crowd nodded faintly, ready to witness a quick ruling, a final dot on a story no one cared to linger on. Judge Thomas Whitaker, renowned for his sternness and decisive rulings, sat high on the bench. His sharp eyes scanned the file before him. To him, this was just one of dozens of cases he handled weekly. His face showed no emotion. His hands turned pages with steady rhythm. He looked up at Edward, who stood with his head bowed, his tangled silver beard hiding most of his weathered face. Whitaker's voice rose, authoritative yet chilling, asking how Edward pleaded. With what little strength remained, Edward answered softly. His hoarse voice seemed trapped in his throat. He admitted his guilt, driven to desperation by hunger. A chuckle rippled from the gallery, as if his confession were a jest. But Whitaker's piercing glare shot toward the sound, sharp as a blade, silencing the room. He bent back to the file, his eyes tracing the dry lines of text. But then, a detail halted his breath. Edward Harlan, former sergeant, United States Army. His voice trailed off, as if pulled into a distant memory. His hands, always steady, gripped the bench's edge, knuckles whitening under the strain. He looked up at Edward, then back to the file, then at Edward again, as if piecing together a forgotten fragment of his past. His face, usually stone-like, flickered with an emotion hard to name. Shock mingled with pain. The courtroom seemed to sense the shift, though no one grasped what was unfolding. Suddenly, Whitaker stood abruptly. The chair creaked under the weight of his unexpected move. The room froze in silence. Judges rarely stood during routine hearings, especially not for a case so small. The crowd, lawyers, and staff exchanged bewildered glances. The young prosecutor stood rigid, still clutching his file, unsure how to respond. Edward, head still bowed, seemed oblivious to the anomaly unfolding. His gaze sank into the stone floor, as if accustomed to the world ignoring him. With a voice hoarse and unsteady, Whitaker declared a 15-minute recess, ordering the defendant to remain. Without explanation, he left the room. His heavy footsteps echoed in the hushed space. As the door to his chambers closed behind him, whispers erupted among the crowd. Some murmured about the judge's strange behavior, a man known for calm and resolve. Others glanced at Edward, wondering what in the homeless man's file held the power to unsettle such a steadfast judge. But Edward stood motionless. His gaunt shoulders trembled faintly in the courtroom's dim light. He didn't know that his desperate act, stealing a loaf to survive, had just stirred a secret from the past, a story buried for 2 decades. In that moment, no one in the courtroom, not even Edward, could foresee that this minor case would spark an emotional journey toward justice. Judge Whitaker, carrying memories of war and a debt of gratitude, was about to confront the man who once saved his life. Edward Harlan, a forgotten hero, stood at a fateful crossroads, where the light of truth and kindness would find its way back, though long delayed. In the quiet of his chambers, Judge Thomas Whitaker shut the door firmly, sealing off the murmurs from the courtroom. A heavy stillness settled in. Only the dim glow of a desk lamp illuminated his face, now pale, brimming with emotion. His trembling hands opened an old drawer. He pulled out a photograph yellowed by time. It showed a group of soldiers before a medical tent in Iraq, the harsh desert sun highlighting their youthful, resolute faces. In the back row, tall and confident, stood Edward Harlan, a younger, stronger version of the homeless man who just faced the bar. Whitaker, once a combat medic before donning a judge's robe, felt his heart constrict. He recognized that soldier, the one who saved his life 2 decades ago, amid the smoke and fire of war. Whitaker's hands, usually steady when wielding the gavel, shook as he held the photo. Memories of Iraq flooded back, sharp, painful, as if they happened yesterday. He set the photo down, opened his laptop, and accessed the military database, a privilege retained from his work with the Veterans Affairs. Edward Harlan's record appeared, each line cutting into Whitaker's mind like a blade. Edward had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, facing dangers most could scarcely imagine. In 2003, he earned the Bronze Star for bravery, driving a burning supply truck away from an ambushed convoy, saving 17 soldiers' lives. Another image in the file stopped Whitaker cold. Edward, face streaked with dust and sweat, carrying an injured Afghan child to a medical helicopter. That photo had graced the front page of the New York Times, making Edward a symbol of American compassion on the edge of life and death. But what stunned Whitaker, as if swept into an emotional whirlwind, was a recently declassified report. In July 2003, during a chaotic evacuation under enemy fire, Edward, despite a leg wound from shrapnel, carried a young medic, Thomas Whitaker himself, 2 miles through perilous terrain to safety. That image, though faded in Whitaker's memory, now sharpened like a slow-motion film. He recalled the roar of explosions, the choking dust, the strength of the soldier who pulled him from death's grasp. "My God, it's him," Whitaker whispered, his voice breaking, as if rediscovering a lost piece of his life. For 20 years, Whitaker had searched for the soldier who saved him, knowing only the name Harlan shouted amid the battlefield's chaos. No address, no contact. Edward seemed to vanish after his discharge. Whitaker, from medic to judge, carried an unpayable debt of gratitude, a mental scar reminding him of another's sacrifice. Now, fate had brought Edward back, not as a celebrated hero, but as a defendant in a petty theft case, standing before him, ragged, invisible to society. As Whitaker grappled with this revelation, Edward sat alone in the courtroom, just steps away. He bowed his head, his gaze lost in the cold stone floor, unaware that his past had just been unearthed. For 15 years, Edward had lived on society's fringes, invisible, like a ghost. After the death of Clara, the wife he loved above all, he renounced all veteran benefits, refused his pension, severed ties with family. The pain of losing Clara, coupled with untreated PTSD, thrust him into a world of solitude. The Veterans Hospital, where he once placed his trust, misdiagnosed Clara's illness, leading to her agonizing death. That failure shattered Edward's faith in the system, prompting him to choose a life without identity, without a home, carrying only his old backpack and a plastic-wrapped photo of Clara. On Brooklyn streets, Edward was treated as a nuisance. Locals passed him with indifferent glances. Some youths threw food at him for sport. Shopkeepers shooed him from sidewalks. Police routinely moved him along when complaints arose. Even other homeless kept their distance from the quiet man, who sometimes woke screaming from war-fueled nightmares. Edward survived by collecting bottles and cans, earning a few coins for cough medicine when winter gripped his lungs. He never begged, never sought help, still bearing the soldier's pride, though the world had forgotten him. In his chambers, Whitaker sat still, his eyes fixed on the old photo. He knew Edward was more than a defendant. He was a hero forgotten by his country. This moment, though late, was a chance for justice to prevail. Fate had shifted, not just for Edward, but for Whitaker, who would soon face his savior, not as a judge, but as a man forever indebted. Edward Harlan's story, from a nameless figure on the streets to a hero reclaimed, was beginning to unfold, carrying the light of kindness and truth. The next morning, the Brooklyn courtroom was packed. Not a single seat remained. An unusual buzz filled the air, as if the entire city had turned its gaze to this seemingly minor case. Outside, reporters jostled, cameras poised to capture every moment, though they were barred from entering. Edward Harlan, 66 years old, stepped in, still in his wrinkled clothes, his old army backpack at his feet. Bewildered by the crowd, his eyes scanned unfamiliar faces, unable to grasp why his bread theft had drawn such attention. Little did he know, his fate was about to take a new turn. where justice and kindness would find their way back. As Edward sat at the defendant's table, he noticed the hasty public defender from yesterday had been replaced by an older man, dignified in bearing. Richard Bennett, a seasoned attorney from the Veterans Defense Alliance, looked at him with warm eyes, as if he'd long known Edward's story. Bennett's presence offered a rare comfort, though Edward still didn't understand what was unfolding. The trial began. A witness took the stand, Colonel William Carter, who had fought alongside Edward in their war years. With a soldier's solemn poise, Carter recounted Edward's bravery. He described that moment in 2003, when Edward, defying danger, drove a burning truck away from an ambushed convoy, saving 17 soldiers. He spoke of the time Edward, though wounded in the leg, carried a young medic, Judge Whitaker, 2 miles under enemy fire to safety. Each word from Carter struck like a hammer, rousing the room from its apathy. Carter paused. His voice grew heavy as he revealed a painful truth. An administrative error in 2008 had severed Edward's veteran benefits, costing him over $246,000 across 15 years. That money, along with medical benefits, could have spared him a life of homelessness. The room fell silent. The truth stood as a silent indictment of a system that abandoned a hero. Edward sat there, his calloused hands gripping the table's edge, his eyes still lowered. It was as if he couldn't believe what was being said about him. Judge Whitaker, high on the bench, could no longer maintain his usual icy demeanor. His eyes shimmered with deep emotion as he looked at Edward. He admitted that for nearly 2 decades, he had searched for the soldier who saved his life, knowing only the name Harlan amid the fog of war. He spoke of a debt of gratitude, of the nation's failure to let a hero like Edward languish in darkness. His words, sincere and weighty, hushed the courtroom. The young prosecutor, once confident in his charges, now stood awkward, finally requesting to drop all accusations. The decision swept through like a breeze, dispelling the heavy air, opening a ray of light for Edward. Suddenly, the courtroom door swung open. A woman in her 30s, eyes red with tears, stepped inside. She walked straight to Edward, her voice choked as she called him uncle. It was Emily, Clara's niece, Edward's late wife. They embraced. Tears streamed down their faces. In that moment, Edward, who had lived in solitude for 15 years, felt the warmth of family for the first time in ages. The room watched in silence, as if the world paused to honor their reunion. Edward's story spread swiftly beyond the courtroom. Mr. Rozzi, the shopkeeper who had called the police, sought Edward out, his face etched with remorse. He admitted he'd seen Edward as a nuisance, unaware he was a hero. A veterans organization launched a fund for Edward, raising over $200,000 in mere days. The Veterans Administration, under public pressure, vowed to review wrongly cut benefits, promising no more would be forgotten, like Edward. His story became a spark, igniting a nationwide conversation about how America treats its veterans. Edward moved to Veterans Village, a supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His small apartment, though simple, was the first place he called home since Clara's death. He lived modestly, but with dignity restored. Edward began speaking at local schools, sharing about military duty and veterans' struggles. His honest, non-judgmental words touched students' hearts, especially those facing hardship, showing them that even in darkness, hope endures. Each afternoon, he sat on a bench in Prospect Park, watching children play, sometimes on the very bench where he once slept through brutal nights. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a bronze plaque was raised, inscribed, "Justice remembers those forgotten." The plaque, alongside a relief depicting Edward carrying Whitaker through battle, became a symbol of patience and truth. Edward, for the first time in years, smiled, a genuine smile, shining in eyes that once only looked down. He knew that kindness and justice, though delayed, always find their way back, like a spring breeze through Brooklyn's cold streets. Share your thoughts and comments below. Spread these inspiring stories to family and friends across the United States.